Good day, Thomas Jefferson Hour podcast listeners, and thanks again, so much thanks for listening. This week, President Jefferson is back and answers listener questions. One we talked about at great lengths was a question sent in about Edmund Burke.
Burke was an extraordinary man. He was part of the circle of Dr. Johnson and Joshua Reynolds and Oliver Goldsmith and James Boswell, part of that great 18th century circle in London led by Dr. Johnson, who's one of my heroes. Johnson, the creator of the great Dictionary of the English Language in 1755 and the author of the Rambler essays and one of the greatest conversationalists who ever lived. And he had his friend, James Boswell of Scotland, so enamored of him that Boswell was able to record Johnson's conversation in a way that has never occurred in history before or since. And so Burke was part of that circle. He was Irish, and he was a great orator, and he was a truly brilliant man, but he was disenchanted, let's put it lightly, by the French Revolution and wrote his famous pamphlet. And so was in this sort of debate with our own Thomas Paine. And even though we love Paine, Paine was a shallow thinker compared to Burke. But Paine was right, at least as Jefferson saw it, that the French Revolution was a necessary bloodletting and a necessary corrective to centuries, even millennia, of systematic abuse. But it's a great theme. And, I wish that our leaders, our governors, our state legislators, our national senators and congressmen and women would read the texts of the Enlightenment, because they are breathtaking, and you cheer up. You believe that humans really can master self-government, and that we really can find ways to pursue happiness when you read these extremely empowering texts. And Jefferson was so fortunate to live at the time that he did and to have access to them through the College of William and Mary, but particularly through his mentors, William Small and George Wythe. He later said that they set the destinies of his life, particularly William Small, and he meant it. And I think that intervention in young Jefferson's life made all the difference. He adored his father, Peter Jefferson, and his father had many admirable qualities, and he was himself a reader, self-taught. But it was really these men of the Enlightenment that made Jefferson Jefferson, and we're all the beneficiaries of this. But all of them were reading Plutarch and Livy and Tacitus and Sallust from the ancient world, and all of them were reading Bolingbroke and Locke and Rousseau and Dr. Johnson and Francis Hutcheson and Adam Smith and Gibbon from the modern world. And that body of knowledge, that shared commitment to the great texts of the Enlightenment and the ancient world, was what made the Founding Fathers what they were. They weren't just people that sparked with revolutionary ideas. They were people that were deeply grounded in this intellectual tradition. And I don't mean any particular snarky disrespect, David, but of the 535 members of Congress, I ask you, how many have read Burke? How many have read Rousseau? How many have read Locke? How many have read Plutarch? How many have read Livy? And the answer is almost none. And if they read it, it was like a forced march through a core curriculum somewhere when they were in college, but they are not actuated by these texts that were the basis for America's astounding breakthrough in human possibility. And you just think, well, why wouldn't they? Why wouldn't they want to know these things and instead just wing it? How can it be that they just wing it when they hold in their hands the destiny of not just America, but the destiny of the planet?
We also had a nice end of the show conversation with a great supporter of your work, Michael Khandelwal.
Yes, he's in Norfolk. He's the founder of the Muse, which is a writing center, and it's amazing. It's in kind of a strip mall in Norfolk, and now it's got a huge online presence thanks to the challenge of the pandemic. And I've had the chance to teach for him there. He introduced me to the publishers of my most recent 2 books. I've known him for a long time. He interviewed me long ago for a sort of a tabloid journal, an arts journal, in the Lower Chesapeake, and we got to know each other, and we've been really good friends. And so he has me come there sometimes when travel is possible, and we've had dinner at some remarkable restaurants in the historic downtown district of Norfolk, and then I've had a chance to teach in his course, the Muse, and in his workshops, and met some really remarkable writers that way. And he got it into his head that he should pony up, take up the challenge of putting my book, Repairing Jefferson's America: A Guide to Civility and Enlightened Citizenship, into the hands of every member of Congress. And I never thought that would happen, frankly. I wanted it to, but I didn't think that it would. And then when somebody came forward, as Michael did, I didn't think it was even possible. What I know is that after 9/11, the idea of getting any physical thing into the hands of any single congressperson is almost impossible. But they were able to work it out thanks to Michael and thanks to certain Virginia-based national legislators and to our own Beth Kaler. They found a mechanism, and the books are, I think, at this moment, finding their way from a shipping entity in the Beltway into the halls of Congress itself.
And with that, sir, we should move along. I will say that next week we will be having Joe Ellis join us in conversation, and in the weeks to come, another conversation scheduled with Lindsay Chervinsky. Any last words before we go to the show?
The Language of Cottonwoods, Essays on the Future of North Dakota, is now out. People can get it in all the usual ways. I'm very, very proud of it. It's I think, the most important thing that I've ever written. I know it's about North Dakota, but it's sort of about something bigger than that, too. And I did actually put one into your hands, I believe, Mr. Swenson.
You did.
So I'll be looking forward to your response when you've had a chance to take a look at it. The Aeneid course is coming up in August. Steinbeck's California is coming up in the early spring. Cuba is full, but there's a waiting list that people can be on. The 2 winter encampments, one is on novels by Charles Dickens, and the other one is really something intriguing, David. Lewis and Clark in winter. So we're because it's winter and we're going to be at Locksaw, I thought we'd look at Lewis and Clark through the lens of their winter experiences. They don't get a lot of play. Because we think of Lewis and Clark as on the road, as moving forward towards the Pacific and back again. But when they hunkered down for the winter, really interesting things happened. And I have a book that's partly about that, called The Character of Meriwether Lewis, about a famous week during their winter at Fort Mandan here in North Dakota. So that's all coming up. And let us go to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. Thanks, everyone. If you can contribute to our success, we take no money for what we do, but we want to expand the size of our megaphone so that we can bring the good news of Jefferson's view of America to as many people as possible, and in this time of modest national healing. Thanks for listening.
Good day, citizens, and welcome to the Thomas Jefferson Hour, your weekly conversation with President Thomas Jefferson. Mr. Jefferson is portrayed by the award-winning humanities scholar and author Clay Jenkinson. I'm your host, David Swenson, and I am so pleased to welcome you back to Conversation, Mr. Jefferson. How are you, sir?
Good day to you, citizen.
Mr. Jefferson, I have a number of questions to present to you this week, questions which have been sent to you by citizens. I suppose this is not unlike the hundreds of questions you received from citizens during your retirement at Monticello.
Well, even during my presidency, I received hundreds, thousands of letters from average Americans, many of whom I never met, most of whom I never had the opportunity to meet. And I was the first president to respond, to the people directly without intermediaries. And some of the letters were abusive, some were effusive, most were thoughtful, concerned about public policy. Very few letters were frivolous. And so I thought it was important that I would respond with my own pen, rather than through an amanuensis or a secretary, to this sort of inquiry, because I think we forget, I think everyone who holds office forgets that we are there in a position of trust with the people, that the people have put us there. They have had the choice to put this person or that person into high office. And when the results were tallied, they chose me, in this case, to be the third president of the United States. I wasn't a king. I was the choice of the people. I represented them. They had placed me there with their will and their ballot. And so I think everyone tends to forget this, that our political office rests on the shoulders of thousands and thousands of good Americans, and that we must not hold ourselves aloof from the people, that we are of the people. But I think that it's a very good thing when a president of the United States does whatever is within his power to stay in a real dialogue with real people. So yes, correspondence with people mattered to me greatly.
Well, I'm certain that people then appreciated your time and your insight, as do our listeners today, sir. I believe at some point in our conversations you've talked about the drudgery of having to answer all this mail. I trust you don't feel that way about our listeners now, sir.
No, I've had a couple of 100 years of rest, and so I'm able now to bring more spirit to this. And of course, this doesn't involve my getting up at dawn and sitting in front of a writing table from dawn until about noon. I once tallied the number of letters that I received, and it was well over 1,000, and most of them from people I didn't know. This was in my retirement at Monticello, and I said to John Adams, compared to this, the life of a cabbage is paradise. But I was in a sense joking. It's a sign of respect that people from all the 17 states in the country, and indeed people in Britain and on the continent of Europe, thought it was in their interest to sit down with a quill pen and crude paper and ink and write me a letter in their own hand and then seal it and pay the cost of posting it. That's a pretty significant gesture that must not be taken lightly.
A cabbage, sir.
A cabbage is paradise, yes. I said at least a mill horse, a mill horse that's going in say a grain grinding mill. At least he knows that eventually he's going to be let out from the harness and get some rest.
Let's go to our first question. It comes from Michael Buckaloo, and it involves wine. Well, spirits, actually. He claims you referred to brandy as wine in a previous conversation and points out that brandy is, in fact, a spirit, not a wine. And he also wonders why you did not mention Madeira. Well, I've heard you mention Madeira, sir, but he describes it as a fortified wine and asks if it's true that Madeira was in the glass to toast the signing of the Declaration of Independence.
I don't think there was a toast to the signing of the Declaration of Independence. That's a lovely myth. But it would have been Madeira. It would have been a fortified wine, surely. And I'll come back to that in a moment. But there was no moment when we all signed the Declaration of Independence. I wrote it along with the help of John Adams and Benjamin Franklin. It was debated for a couple of days in Congress. Then it was unanimously adopted. And it was printed that same day on the 4th of July, 1776, but the original copy that I had produced was sent to what's called an engraver, you would maybe say a calligrapher, and he spent several weeks putting it into the sort of beautiful form that it eventually achieved, and then it was brought back to what you call Independence Hall, and we signed it, but we didn't sign it at a single ceremonial moment. People signed it as they came and went in the Second Continental Congress. So it's a lovely story. But to get back to why it would have been Madeira, it certainly would have been a fortified wine. And here's why. Wine is delicate, fragile, does not travel well. And the British understood this. And so they fortified their wine, sherry and brandy and Madeira and so on, because that made them hold up better chemically in the jostling and in the varieties of heat and long storage at the bottom of crude wooden ships and so on. And so these fortified wines made it possible at least to have something that you could call wine in the far-flung British Empire. But when I was in France in 1787, I made a wine tour of France and northern Italy, and I worked out the logistics, the physical logistics of shipping true wine successfully, and that involves a certain commitment to padding and temperature control, and maybe only in certain seasons would it be shipped, and it would be nestled in a way that it would not get too much jostling or breakage in transit. And so I helped to invent the transatlantic wine trade because I made it possible for the first time for true wines to cross the Atlantic successfully and profitably. And so I said that nobody who's ever had the chance to drink true wine would ever return to fortified wines. That was a stopgap measure that the British created, and then it developed a constituency. People learned to like it, but that's because they were not drinking Bordeaux or Burgundy.
Sir, this next question, I almost hesitate to bring it to you. I do not want to upset you, sir. It concerns the British royals and comes from Robert Rosen. If you wish, we can just move on, or I'll present this question to you.
Well, let's hear it. I pride myself on being an open-minded man.
He writes, "Dear sir, recently the country was enthralled by a televised interview with a British prince and his American-born wife. I will spare you the tawdry details. However, one effect of this program was the revelation that there exist a surprising number of defenders of the British monarchy in certain quarters of the United States. I must warn you, Mr. Jefferson, that these next few sentences may be unpleasant. One prominent American magazine just published a piece entitled An American Defense of Britain's Constitutional Monarchy that claims that, quote, the royal family is not simply an important part of British culture. It represents a valuable political inheritance, one to which Americans owe a great deal."
Well, I am grinding my teeth now. To think that we would waste a single moment talking about monarchy in the 21st century, I find both ridiculous, absurd, and appalling. We broke with Great Britain in 1776, partly because of the way that they were treating us and their colonial administration. But we also were Republicans. That is, we believe that government takes its authority from the people themselves, and that it must rest on the shoulders of the people, and it must do the people's will as it is decided through elections, and that the idea of a single person having the power of life and death over millions of other human beings, and to make that a hereditary business, that's just, I suppose I must say, nonsense. And I would have hoped by now in your country that there wouldn't be a single American who would find anything that the royal family of Britain or any other country had to say, even momentarily interesting. I once said if you took all the crowned heads of Europe and molded them into a single individual, all of them, every duke, every earl, every prince, every king or queen, and molded them into one single human being, he would not deserve to be elected vestryman of the merest parish church in Virginia. Hereditary monarchy is a contradiction in terms for government, because why would we think that the child, the eldest male child of an existing monarch, would have the capacity to fulfill that office in himself? Do we think that the child of a poet necessarily can write poems, or the child of a warrior is inevitably a good warrior? Or, as I put it once to Colonel Hamilton, do you think that calculus and other high mathematics can be passed from father to son through
Please,
their loins?
Mr. Jefferson, calm yourself if you would. I will end this letter how Mr. Rosen ended it, saying he was wondering if perhaps you could give America a much-needed reminder of the evils of monarchy. He says no one is more qualified to do so, and then says he apologizes if he's upset you. Again, that's from Robert Rosen in Lakeland, Florida.
Well, he has not upset me by sending me this letter, because it's an important time to catechize ourselves, that America stands for something infinitely more principled and noble than a hereditary monarchy. And to think that the interview that is in question here was not even of somebody in line for the throne. We're talking about somebody who is never going to be the king of Great Britain and his American wife, and I'm ashamed of an American woman that would marry into such an institution, but that's a private matter. But, this is not even somebody who will eventually hold power. This is somebody who apparently has renounced what limited connection he had to royalty. So it just seems to me that you must be a very prosperous and luxurious people to have a single moment of time to spend on this sort of idiocy.
Thank you very much, Mr. Jefferson. We're going to take a short break. Perhaps you can as well and refresh yourself. I have some more interesting questions when we return.
This is going to take some fortified wine.
Very good. We'll be back in just a moment. You're listening to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. Welcome back to the Thomas Jefferson Hour, your weekly conversation with President Thomas Jefferson. Welcome back. Are you better, sir?
I'm practicing deep breathing exercises to think that Americans can be fascinated by royalty.
You know, a wise man once wrote that when upset, quietly count to 10. If very upset, count to 100.
You are correct, sir. I was at 385 during our break.
We have some more questions, sir. This one comes from Jason Morrison. I would be interested in hearing Mr. Jefferson's thoughts and his reaction to Edmund Burke's reflections on the Revolution in France. How did Burke's view compare with Jefferson's? Did this work change Jefferson's view of Mr. Burke?
Well, first of all, Burke, who was Irish, a member of Parliament in Great Britain, was an advocate for American liberty. During the great contest that led to our independence, he spoke on behalf of the American people, and he tried to caution the British monarchy and the Parliament to treat us generously because we were undoubtedly an asset to the British Empire, and that we would all be better off within the British system than if we split. And he's an extremely gifted orator and a brilliant man. I think he was wrong about the French Revolution. He wrote his book in response to Thomas Paine's book. They were locked in a dispute about the meaning and the significance and the validity of the French Revolution. Burke was a much more deeply serious political thinker, but Burke believes in gradualism. He believes that revolutionary tumult, and certainly there was a great deal of it in France, is more disruptive than constructive, and that gradualism, reform, moving carefully from within a position of conserving as much of the existing social order as possible is the correct remedy for human problems. Paine and I are on the other end of that spectrum. I believe that there are times when there is no remedy except revolution, but I think that the French people, having suffered for centuries, even millennia, under extremely difficult economic conditions of serfdom and social hierarchies that ground the poor to powder, it seems to me that telling them that they should work gradually for reform is a heartless argument and a heartless prescription. So I believe that Paine was right, that the French Revolution was right and righteous, that it was a necessary bloodletting, that there were unfortunate excesses, of course, as there are in all revolutions, but that these are the price of human liberty, and that if we renounce violence as a tool for human liberty, we will live forever, probably, under despotic regimens. And so I think that the truth is on Paine's side, and the heresy, really, is Burke's. If Burke were right that gradualism works, we'd only have one question: how long will it take?
Burke wrote that he did not like abstract thinking, that freedom and equality were different, that a genuine equality must be judged by God, and that liberty was a construct of the law and no excuse to do whatever one would like. Did he influence your thinking, sir?
No, but he helped me. this is an important debate. This is not a one-sided question. I abhor violence. And so, of course, I'm interested in Burke's argument. I'm a gradualist, too. So I think his contribution is an important one, but it's an important one because we need to argue. We need to have lively, serious, thoughtful, evidence-based debates about these questions. And there's no single position that's ever the only right one.
Well, I'm certain that there are things that Burke wrote that you would agree with. I can give you an example.
Yes, sir, of course.
He believed that men cannot handle large amounts of power and wrote, quote, "When men play God, presently they behave like devils."
That's a little strong, but I do agree that giving power to a single individual is a very bad idea. So you would expect Burke, therefore, to be in favor of the French Revolution, which took absolutist power away from the king, from Louis XVI, and put it into the hands of a National Assembly instead. So, I think he would say, if he were here, that the French Revolution had its merits, but it went wrong by the terrible excesses that led to the Reign of Terror.
And I think that's the inspiration for that statement, is he was afraid that when revolutionaries came into power, they would play God.
Well, I've seen it, of course, and I must say I detected some seeds of it in myself. When you hold office, you believe that you are better informed than others. You become a little thin-skinned and righteous about your own authority, and you take dissent personally and often with a certain type of bitterness. I saw this in myself at times, which is why I believe so strongly in a Republican system of government where there's the president, but the president is not a king, and he can be checked by the two houses of Congress and by the courts and by state governments and by the re-election principle that every fourth year he must stand before the American people and ask them if they want to continue him in office. So I do certainly believe that concentrating power in the hands of a single person, especially if it's unchecked power, is a disastrous mistake.
So that may be one area where you would agree with Burke. Another area I think you would agree with Burke is that he expressly repudiated the idea of a divinely appointed monarchy.
Well, certainly. The idea that God has a role in this is absurd. Think of it this way. I always like to go back to radical foundation principles. So let's say that there are 1,000 people living on an island somewhere, and they're all just people going about their lives of feeding themselves and their children and building shelters and harvesting crops, whatever they might be growing or harvesting from the sea. And some very powerful person amongst them, some ambitious person, some person with a gigantic sense of his own righteousness, suddenly declares himself to be the king. And maybe there's a brief civil war where rival barons are attempting to overmaster the state. But eventually, let's say this one wins, let's call him Hamilton, this one wins and becomes the king of the island of X. And then he says, well, I'm going to pass that down to my son and we'll be kings forever. And this is how it happened, that some warlord, some strongman, some person of particular ambition and a commitment to violence became the first king. It wasn't elective. People didn't have a caucus and say, let's decide which one of us should be the warlord of this island. Someone grabbed power. And when he grabbed power, he surrounded himself with henchmen, earls and dukes and so on. And then he made all this hereditary so they could keep this power in their own families in perpetuity, if possible. That's the origin of kingship. It doesn't come from God. It comes from self-assertion. Most people are content to be governed, or certainly most people are content not to strive to be the governor. But some men are deeply ambitious, and that's their goal in life. And once they get that power, they use it ruthlessly, and they install their sons to succeed them. And this is how dynastic government occurs. And then to cover the ground and make it seem as if this is somehow legitimate, they bring in bishops and priests to say, oh yeah, that's how God wanted it to be, that Earl X is now going to be the the King of England. He's God's chosen minister on earth. It's insane.
Let me read one more quote from Burke to you, if I might, sir.
Yes, sir.
Society is indeed a contract. It is a partnership in all science, a partnership in all art, a partnership in every virtue, and in all perfection. As the ends of such a partnership cannot be obtained in many generations, it becomes a partnership not only between those who are living, but between those who are living, those who are dead, and those who are to be born. I hear an echo of some of your logic in that, sir.
Yes, within limits. I do think that we must create a line of demarcation between one generation and the next. Mr. Madison, I think, would be more likely to support that quotation by Edmund Burke than I would be, because I do think that there's continuity in culture, of course, and that we owe something to the future. We need to leave the land as fertile as we found it. That's the concept of usufruct. And we owe something to our forebears, and we owe something to those yet unborn. And we certainly don't want to saddle them with an artificial national debt that they did not vote to assume. So I see the point of continuity in culture, and that life is a continuum. But I think that we can emphasize that too much, that we need to understand that each new generation has freedom to repudiate what has come before, and each new generation should inherit the world unencumbered by indebtedness and laws that are not based on nature.
It's of great interest to me, and I suspect many of our listeners too, how much you and your contemporaries were influenced by the work of others, those who came before you or those who were writing while you were alive. Men like Rousseau, John Locke, Voltaire. How did you discuss these things amongst your contemporaries? How did it influence you in the work that you did, sir?
Well, it depends, of course. So I was lucky because my mentor tutor at William and Mary was a member of the Scottish Enlightenment, and later the Lunar Society of Birmingham in England, and was very well versed in the texts of the Enlightenment, and put them into my hands. And Madison was lucky up at the College of New Jersey, now Princeton, because Witherspoon, the president of that institution, and himself Scottish, was also enamored of the Scottish and the European Enlightenment, and he put the same texts into the hands of James Madison. So we were very fortunate in this regard. We were part of the avant-garde learning of the Enlightenment. We weren't hearkening back to scholasticism and Thomas Aquinas and so on. And so those texts included Rousseau, whom I didn't much admire, Locke, certainly one of the great thinkers in the history of Britain, Isaac Newton, of course, whose mechanics taught us that the world is knowable and operates by discernible laws. Francis Bacon, one of my three intellectual heroes, along with Newton and Locke. Bacon was essential for understanding that reason and the science of induction can help us not only understand the world, but to manipulate nature for human prosperity and human happiness. And there were all sorts of other. Bolingbroke, very important on deism and freedom of religion. The list is long of these authors. And so I was fortunate in three ways. First, I was fortunate to be born when I was, because the Enlightenment was flowering not only in the old world, but in the new. And as I say, I had mentors who were exemplars of the Enlightenment and put those books into my hands. I was fortunate, secondly, because I was a privileged Virginian. Most people did not have the opportunity, as I did, to study for 7 or 8 or 10 years before entering economic life. Most people don't get to go to college at all in my time, and just putting food in one's mouth is essential, and I did not ever have to face that as a significant issue. And then third, my mentors urged me to read broadly and deeply and to question everything. Diderot, the great master of the French encyclopedia, said everything has to be re-examined. Everything has to be tested against the criteria of reason and good sense and human happiness, that we have to, we don't need to accept any single idea, not even religious and theological ideas, as final and established. We must bring a kind of generous skepticism to absolutely every idea, no matter where it comes from, and no matter how great its seeming authority is. And so I was very, very fortunate in this regard, and was able to be something of an intellectual and a philosopher at a time when most people were just scraping together their next day's dinner and trying to keep the rain from falling on their heads. So in this sense, I was fortunate. Many of the founding fathers were fortunate. We were deeply enamored of the books and the principles of the Enlightenment, and we were lucky that the institutions where we studied had just sort of gotten on board with those ideas.
Before we end this segment of our conversation, Mr. Jefferson, I want to go back to Burke's assertion that society is a contract between the past, present, and future. And there are two men that you've just mentioned in your conversation, sir, that I hear echoes of in your writing. One is Rousseau, who says, "Man is born free, and everywhere he is in chains." And then John Locke, who says, "All mankind being all equal and independent, no one ought to harm another in his life, health, liberty, or possessions." These things must have influenced you, sir.
Of course. I read widely in the texts of the Enlightenment, including Rousseau. I would say that Locke was 8 or 10 times more important to me than Rousseau, because Locke, in his second treatise on government, really set down the basis for the social contract, and also for the right to revolution when any government becomes destructive of the pursuit of human happiness and equality, liberty, and justice. And so you could say that the Declaration of Independence is as indebted to Locke's second treatise on government as it was indebted to anything. And I was very fortunate to spend a good deal of time reading Locke, including his epistemology, which was every bit as important as his treatises on government. Rousseau certainly is right. It's a little bit of a dramatic statement. A man is born free and is everywhere in chains. But I subscribe to the notion that we enchain ourselves, and we're like Gulliver, amongst the Lilliputians. They chained him down when he was sleeping on the beach. When he woke up, all he had to do was flex his muscles to break those chains. And I think if humanity ever really wants to throw off its chains, it has the capacity to do so. But we enchain ourselves by reverence for tradition and habit, by the kind of conservatism that Burke represents. We don't want to be violent, we don't want to shed blood, or we don't want to move too far too fast. Those ideas can be self-imprisoning, and they have been through the history of the world. I mean, think of the French. 19 million out of 20, maybe 19.8 million out of 20 million French people lived in the worst sort of poverty and degradation. And they put up with it because their priests said, this is how God intended it. This is the best of all possible worlds. God's looking out for us. This must be the social system that God prefers. And the priests were in bed with the aristocrats and were using superstitions and fear and false notions of hell and purgatory and sin to enchain people in lives of appalling poverty and degradation. And the people were so cowed by these religious entities, these men who thought that they were the gatekeepers to heaven, that they refused to stand up for their own rights. And it took a very, very, very long time before the French Revolution was touched off. And then, as I said to Lafayette, after centuries of abuse, when the revolution finally comes, the people are not going to be polite. I said, did you expect to be transported from despotism to liberty on a featherbed? That's not how it works.
We need to take a break, Mr. Jefferson, but it is fair to say that America's origins are rooted in some of the writings of the Enlightenment men that we've talked about.
Absolutely. No Enlightenment, no America. It's that simple.
Thank you so very much, Mr. Jefferson. We're going to take a short break. but we'll return in just a moment. You're listening to the Thomas Jefferson Hour.
Welcome back to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. I'm Clay Jenkinson, out of tights. My wig has been removed. My buckled shoes are safely put into their proper place. I'm actually bathing my feet in ice water, David.
Yeah. Well, after that bit about the Royals, I was afraid Jefferson was gonna walk off again. But I really enjoyed talking to him about Burke. It's interesting to me, I've got a copy of The Social Contract, and I've got a couple of Locke's books, the second treatise on government, and you can pretty much open them up anywhere, either one of those books, and read Jefferson.
Well, there were certain ideas in the air, and so I'm glad we talked about this today, and I'm glad for our listener questions, including the one on the royal family, because I think it's an important thing for Americans to hear from Jefferson about this. We're all a little bit fascinated by this, the pomp, the circumstance. I was in England just before Prince Charles married Lady Diana Spencer. I was actually in Wyoming when the wedding occurred, but my pals back at Oxford had an all-night party to celebrate this, and it was a very, very big deal. And we watched that marriage fall apart, of course, and we've seen a lot of cataclysm too. And of course, I lamented the death of Prince Philip. I met him once at an event in England, and I was 6 or 7 feet away from him with my parents in Edinburgh one time, and the Queen too. And of course, you can't help but feel a little bit thrilled to be in the presence of these people until you step back and think, well, they're just like people A, B, C, and X who are designated really artificially, profoundly, abstractly and artificially to be the king and the queen, or the queen and the prince of England, the royal family. And the more we get to know the royal family, the more we realize they're just people, and in many respects, not very interesting people at that. I have some reverence for the Queen. I think she's been an extraordinary monarch. I watched the Queen. I watched several of the miniseries, and I think she's a very extraordinary human being who has presided, on the whole, very well over the British people. But I'm ashamed to even admit all of that. But going back to the Enlightenment for just a moment, yes, there were certain ideas in the air. One of them was that people can govern themselves. That was new. It has ancient roots, but that was one of the central ideas of the Enlightenment. The idea that human reason should be our oracle, that we should. I love what Diderot says, that everything must be challenged, everything must be tested against good sense and reason and evidence and skepticism. These ideas that knowledge is knowable, and that it can be codified. It can be written up in encyclopedias and in almanacs and treatises. And Newton's idea that the world is not random. The world has underlying laws. That's just a breathtaking concept, and we all know it's true. But the idea that when a meteor is hurtling towards the Earth from some place in space, that we can figure it out. We can figure out how close it's going to come to the Earth, how fast it's moving, what its orbit is around the sun, how that orbit might change over time. The idea that we sent a probe to Mars and we landed it safely, and now there is a drone, a helicopter that's flying around the surface of Mars, and that humans are able to measure this. Think of that we could. Mars is a planet that's hurling through space, and we're a planet that's hurling through space, and we're spinning and it's spinning. We're all part of a larger solar system where all sorts of different gravitational tugs are at work. And we can take a little canister the size of a Volkswagen and blast it with a rocket off from an American launch pad, and after X number of months, it goes into orbit of another celestial object spinning through space, millions and millions of miles away. It's absolutely breathtaking. And Newton said, if you figure out these laws, you can do this sort of thing. But you have to be able to figure out these laws. You can't just take a gun the way you would sort of try to kill an antelope by figuring out where's it going to be 6 seconds from now. You have to work these out by very precise mathematical formulae, but it can be done. And if you know these things, your power, your capacity to shape the universe for human benefit goes straight through the roof. So those are the principles of the Enlightenment: the rights of man, the capacity of rationality, the people's inherent right to self-government, the underlying laws of the universe, the breathtaking power of the human mind. This was the most exciting thing that ever happened, and in some ways it challenged Christianity. Eventually they made it kind of a peace, but it really rocked the world, and Jefferson was just like totally intoxicated by it. But he did not like Rousseau at all, and he could put up with Burke, but he was not as likely to be an admirer of Burke as was his friend Mr. Madison.
Yeah, I'm not a real fan of Rousseau either, but you open his books and read things, and Jefferson's all over it. I guess that was really the thing that I took away from this, is that yes, there were brilliant thinkers amongst the founding fathers, and there were some original ideas, but not all of it was original. It came from somewhere. We need to say goodbye to this part of the conversation and welcome a good friend of yours, somebody who's done an extraordinarily generous thing, Michael Khandelwal.
David, I'm really eager and delighted to introduce my friend from the lower Chesapeake, from Norfolk, Michael Khandelwal. We've known each other now for, almost 15 years, I think, and we've become very good friends, and he has done a truly extraordinary thing. He has stepped up to underwrite the distribution of my book, Repairing Jefferson's America, A Guide to Civility and Enlightened Citizenship, to, wait for it, every member of the Congress of the United States, 100 senators, 435 representatives. So, David, please welcome to the Jefferson Hour, Michael Khandelwal.
Good to have you here, Michael.
Thank you, David, and thank you, Clay. It's great to talk to you today.
Let me give some background. So the book has been out now for about a year, and I challenged our Jefferson Hour listeners to help us get it into the hands of state legislators. And my ultimate dream, which I thought it was unlikely, was that we would eventually get this into the hands of members of Congress too. And I think we now are up to 14 states, so there's still plenty of room for those who might wish to do this, to put this book into the hands of every state legislator in the country. But then you sort of rolled in a few months ago and said that you would like to see this book in the hands of members of Congress. So explain your thinking.
Well, sure. In the interest of stability and friendship, I was very excited about the book when it came out, and also I realized that you had already given all the Virginia Commonwealth legislators the book, you and John Kohler, the publisher, and so I was like, gosh, well, what can I do? Because I'd like to be involved, because I really do think that statespersonship is very important, and I think civility comes with that. There's too much infighting and too much bickering to really get things done in the country that we need to get done. And I thought, well, maybe a reminder to those who are in power of the importance of being civil and caring about the country above your own personal goals would be a good reminder to give them. And I saw that on your website that the U.S. Congress was still available, and I thought, well, why don't I make a difference there? Because even if one person in Congress reads that book and talks about it to one other person, I think that would make a big change of the way people treat each other and the way they listen to each other.
It's a great and most generous gift to the country and to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. Certainly, we take no profits here from it. In fact, we do everything in our power to make the book available to those who wish to present it to state legislatures, or to, in this case, to Congress at the lowest possible printing cost. And it has been my dream, exactly what you say, Michael, that no part of me thinks that 535 people are going to read this book. But if a handful of legislators looked into it and thought, that Jefferson was right, that this only works if there is a level of mutual respect and civility and decorum, I think that could make a difference. All change really comes about from small, seemingly insignificant moments. And I think that, you tell me if I'm wrong, Michael, but I think out of the 535 members of Congress, the majority of them are troubled, as you and I and David are, by the breakdown of American civility.
I think that they are, and I think it's a good moment to also mention that your staff had some help from the staffs of Representative Elaine Luria and Senator Tim Kaine in figuring out the best way to get the books to everyone in Congress, and that just goes to show that Virginians are very interested in statespersonship and civility and respect.
I love that you say my staff. You mean Beth Kaler, who is a superb logistics manager and is a producer of the Thomas Jefferson Hour. She's terrific at what she does. And one of the problems that we had to work out is, okay, it's one thing to try to do this, but in the post 9/11 world, at a time when most communications are now electronic, given the issue of security and also of conflict of interest and so on, is it even possible to put a physical book as a gift into the hands of 535 members of Congress? And I was frankly pretty skeptical. But no, it's great, isn't it?
And you're right. Beth was fantastic. She researched everything. She reached out to the right people. She figured out the laws to make sure that we were in compliance with the law, which is very important as well.
Michael, I was just going to ask you if there's anything in the book that really motivated you, anything in particular in the book that really motivated you to take this action.
Well, I think Clay already said it. I mean, this idea that Jefferson really thought that to make this great American experiment work, there had to be mutual respect. There had to be this coming to the table together to try to figure out the best way to serve all the people. And I feel like that's just a message that rings through time to us today, and it's something that we need to always remember when we're dealing with our personal lives, when we're dealing with our civic lives, or our professional lives.
That sounds real good, but it's a pretty heated environment right now. Do you think the book will really make a difference?
Again, I think it will. I think that most members of Congress, have good intentions. Maybe they get a little bit caught up sometimes in partisanship, but I think that there's good intentions out there, and I think it will make a difference. It's a good reminder. I think the more people get reminded of being respectful. If you remember, when your parents were raising you and your mom, reminded you to say please or say thank you, it eventually became ingrained with those reminders.
So it's exactly what Jefferson thought. In his famous letter about artificial good humor, he says, it's best to be born as a good-humored human being, and some are. But if you aren't, you can learn to be civil, polite, good-humored, tolerant, generous, respectful, polite. And that not only does this make life better for everyone around you, but in a sense, it teaches those who are uncivil it either shames them or encourages them to try this smoother method. Jefferson's motto was take things always by their smooth handle. And he tried really in a profound way to be the most civil man in America. And in many respects, he was. And so even though today, we worry about Jefferson and slavery and Jefferson and Sally Hemings and Jefferson's occasional duplicity as a political figure and the displacement of Native Americans and Jefferson as a male chauvinist of a sort of typical sort from his time, there are lots of reasons today why people are a little skeptical of Jefferson, but there's more to him than that. And I tried very hard in the book to say we need the Jefferson who believed we are up to the task of living in a republic and that we can govern ourselves and that we can be enlightened. We need that Jefferson now more than ever, and we can't jettison him generally just because we cringe at some of his attitudes with respect to gender and race. So I tried very hard in the book to differentiate the Jeffersonian, which I think is essential to the future of the country, from Thomas Jefferson himself, who's, as we all know, taking something of a beating these days.
And taking that attitude, it also reminds us that change and positivity is possible. That we can look at a man and also what he stands for in a way that we can learn from his mistakes. We can learn from things that we may not like in looking back, and we can use that as an example to do better.
Michael, before we lose you, tell our listeners a little bit about the Muse and the work you're doing to encourage writers in the Lower Chesapeake.
I would love to, and I want to just make clear that my donation to the book giving is not involved with the Muse Writers Center, because we're not political at a nonprofit. The Muse Writers Center in Norfolk, Virginia is a literary center. It's a creative writing place. We have classes for beginners to professional writers. We have hundreds of events a year, which are all free. We have a physical place, which is currently closed, but will hopefully reopen soon for writers to come and work. And we do a lot of outreach. We go into schools during non-pandemic times. We work with youth organizations, with at-risk youth and also gifted youth. We work with senior centers, seniors in memory care, assisted living, and more, and also the military and veteran population to help people tell their story, to find a voice, and to work on the power of words, whether they are doing it, say, to pass on their story to their grandchildren, or they want to write the next great science fiction novel, or a poem to read at an inauguration someday. We're there for them, and we're the only center in the country to have a very robust tuition help policy, so no one is ever turned away from a class, even though the tuition is very low. We will fund somebody if they want to take the class and commit to it. And right now, everything we're doing is online. So people hearing my voice in California or in North Dakota can take a class or come see an event online. Of course, we're excited that hopefully that we'll be able to be in person soon, but we'll still keep the online component going. And as a matter of fact, you, Clay, have a book launch and reading and discussion coming up in June for your new book about North Dakota. I'm very excited to host that with you.
There goes that Beth Kaler again.
Hey, thanks, Michael. Great to talk.
Good talking with you, my friend.
You're doing a wonderful thing.
Well, thank you all, and Clay, nice talking to you too. And we'll chat again soon.
Let's keep in touch. Thank you. Bye for now.
Thank you, guys.
Michael Khandelwal of Norfolk. He's the founder of the Muse, which you can find at the-muse.org. I'm immensely grateful, David, to Michael Khandelwal and his thought that if you're going to do this, do it right. Get it into the hands of Congress.
Yes, what a wonderful thing, a generous thing he has done. And with that, sir, it's time for us to say goodbye this week.
Yes, we'll see you all next week for another important and exciting edition of the Thomas Jefferson Hour.
The Thomas Jefferson Hour is brought to you each week by Dakota Sky Education. The program is distributed nationally by Prairie Public. President Thomas Jefferson lived from 1743 to 1826, and this program presents his views. President Jefferson is portrayed by the award-winning humanities scholar and author Clay S. Jenkinson. To obtain a copy of this or any show for a $12 donation, please call 701-575-0727. This program is also available online at jeffersonhour.com and on Apple Podcasts. If you'd like to correspond with President Jefferson or submit a question for him to answer on the program, please visit the website at jeffersonhour.com. The Thomas Jefferson Hour is produced at Makoche Recording Studios in Bismarck, North Dakota. Bach Cello Suite No. 3 in C Major by Stephen Swinford. Thank you for listening. Please tune in again next week for another thought-provoking, historically accurate program, Through the Eyes of Thomas Jefferson.